Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of John's never-ending list of random things to do. For today's video, I will be working on my 1985 Toyota Celica Supra. Now the problem here is, the power steering pump was leaking all over the place, but I never changed it. And ultimately, it killed my alternator. So I will be showing you guys how I changed my power steering pump. To begin, since I am missing the fan shroud, I will be only removing these four 12mm nuts. And once they have been removed, remove your fan. Next, you'll want to loosen this 14mm bolt. Now with that loose, using a 14mm socket, turn this bolt counterclockwise until the AC belt can be removed completely. Now it's time to remove this 19mm nut. Before you attempt to replace your power steering pump, this is the first nut you'll want to try to remove. My nut was stuck on there pretty good, and I even applied liquid wrench for a whole week. It still wouldn't budge. So I went out and got one of these stubby impact, and it just barely fit between the radiator and the power steering pump. Now I can easily shoot the nut out and remove this washer. Now before I proceed to loosen anything else, I'm gonna see if this pulley can be pulled out. So I'm just gonna wiggle it a few times, and it seems to not be seized, so I'll continue. I just loosened these 14mm bolts on the front side, and I completely removed this 14mm bolt on the back side. Great, now just apply pressure to your power steering pump, and the belt can be easily removed. You'll want to completely remove your pulley now. Just wiggle it back and forth and it'll just come right out. If you're planning to rebuild your power steering pump, don't lose this key. So I went on ahead and retightened this 14mm bolt right here. I then prepared a spill container. So when I loosen this hose, I can capture any fluid that falls out. Well, that didn't go according to plan. With most of the fluid drained, you'll want to loosen these two 14mm bolts. Moving on to the backside, you'll see these two 12mm bolts that you'll want to loosen as well. For this next nut, you can use a 17mm wrench, or you can use a 5/8 flare nut wrench. I took precautions and used the flare nut wrench so I wouldn't ruin the nut. And once you have it loose, go ahead and completely remove it. You also want to have something to catch the spill here. In my case, I just used a towel. Using a 17mm wrench, loosen this piece. It might be a good idea to make some markings so you know which hose go where. Since mine were old and brittle, I thought it'd be easier to just cut them and replace them. Since I cut the hose, I made an extra marking so I know which one connects where. Now that everything is disconnected from the power steering pump, I can go ahead and remove these two 14mm bolts completely and remove the power steering pump. Now with the power steering pump out, you'll want to recycle this item right here. So go ahead and completely remove it, and using brake cleaner, clean it as best as possible. You'll also want to reuse your reservoir if your new power steering pump didn't come with one. Once the four bolts have been removed, grip the power steering pump and the reservoir, pull them apart while wiggling it. Eventually they'll separate. You'll also want to shoot brake cleaner inside the reservoir, but through the bottom. That way if there are any contaminants stuck in the filter within the reservoir, it'll come out. Now here's the new power steering pump, and these are the items it comes with: a new key and a seal for the reservoir. Now right out of the box, I ran into some issue with this Woodruff key. It doesn't even fit into the slot here. I also tried using my old Woodruff key, and it didn't even fit. Another thing I didn't like was this O-ring. It looked way too small, so I ordered a rebuild kit. And this is the O-ring it came with. Look at the difference. In order to get the Woodruff key to fit, I had to grind down both sides. And look, now it fits perfectly. Now with the Woodruff key on, it's time to see if the pulley fits. And that's perfect. Alright. Now it's time to install the reservoir. In order to do so, you'll have to take off these two bolts in the front. If you don't have an impact or a vise to hold the power steering pump, you can reinstall the pump as is onto the car and reinstall all the necessary components. Make sure you use Dextron or Dextron 2 automatic transmission fluid. I will be applying it to the rubber seal as a lubricant. Then go ahead and slip it on the bottom side of the reservoir. You might want to apply some of that fluid inside this hole here as well. If you find it difficult to reinstall the reservoir, you might have to bend these four tabs out a little. Once you have done so, Slide it onto the pump and apply some pressure, and it'll just pop right into place. Now I'm just going to thread these 4 bolts in, and I'll torque them down to spec once it's been installed on the vehicle. You'll also want to reinstall this piece here. I applied some Teflon tape just for insurance. Since the hoses aren't here anymore, I transferred this marking over. Then once you're ready, go ahead and just snug it down. The power steering pump is now ready to be reinstalled. Align the mounting hose and thread in these bolts by hand. The 3 bolts will hold the power steering pump in position, so you can torque these 2 bolts to 37 foot-pounds. And then just snug the other 2. Go ahead and reinstall the high pressure hose. Thread it in as far as you can by hand, and then just snug it down. Then proceed to install the vacuum hoses. And if you forgot which one goes where, this is where your marking comes in handy. I ended up replacing the vacuum hoses. You can easily obtain them at your local auto store. And once you've obtained them, you can cut them down to the length you need for your installation. The pulley can now be reinstalled. Place it back into its location. Then apply the washer and the 19mm nut. Tighten it down by hand, and then torque it down to 27 foot-pounds. I ended up replacing the return line here as well. I kept it long so I could drain the old fluid out. I also have an extra piece here, which will be attached to the reservoir here, so the hose will be sitting higher than the top of the reservoir. That way the fluid doesn't flush back out this way. But if you have these rubber end caps, you can use them instead. So I inserted just a portion of this hose. That way it's easier to remove later for the final installation. And I just placed the hose onto the side where it wouldn't fall over. The power steering belt can now be reinstalled. If this belt hasn't been changed yet, I would highly recommend you replace it since you have everything disassembled already. Now apply some downward pressure to the pump and slide the belt on over to the pulley. Insert this piece right here. Then insert the fan. Once the fan has been inserted, thread in the 4 nuts and then snug them down. To apply tension to the belt, you want to pull your power steering pump upwards, being very careful to not break anything. Then using your wrench, tighten this bolt right here. And you'll want to tighten the one in the back here as well. Once those 2 have been tightened, tighten this 14mm bolt. Now we're ready to fill the reservoir with power steering fluid. You'll want to start the car shortly to pump all the old fluid out. And keep an eye on the reservoir so it doesn't run empty. Then shut off the car and refill the reservoir with more power steering fluid. If the pump isn't pumping fluid through, you can turn your steering wheel left and right. Then continue to repeat those steps. I had to dump the fluid from this container and went through 1 whole quart of power steering fluid. And eventually, the fluid came out bright red. This is what you want. So it's finally time to remove this temporary hose. You'll want to have a rag with you to catch any spills. In this case, I used it to block off the reservoir. And now it's finally time to reinstall the return hose onto the reservoir. Do your best to get it as high up as possible, and then clamp it down. If you need to apply more power steering fluid, now would be a good time. And if you put in too much power steering fluid, or you overfilled it, use a turkey baster to suck it back out. If your engine is cold and your fluid is still cold, you'll want the fluid in this area. But if your engine is warm and your fluids are hot, you'll want it in this area. You'll want to start your car again and turn your steering wheel left and right. Then recheck your reservoir to see if the fluid levels are correct or if there are any remaining bubbles. If you still have bubbles, continue to let your car run and turn the steering wheel left and right until there are little to no bubbles. And that's all it takes to replace your power steering pump. Now this portion of the engine bay and my alternator can stay dry. Since my AC isn't working at the moment, I decided to not reinstall this belt, but you should retighten this bolt before you close your hood. I hope some of you found this video helpful. If you did and you liked it, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed yet, maybe even consider subscribing. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys for the next random project.